Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's lecture. So, today we're going to talk about Chapter 3. We're going to do it all in one lecture because there's really not a lot to it. This is where we introduce negative numbers. Okay. So, negative numbers, they might seem a little bit strange, but they really are pretty intuitive because they're basically just what we were doing with subtraction. And we can usually think about it in terms of subtraction. And if it gets confusing, we can always go back to a number line. So there's not a lot of difference to them, which is why this chapter is so short, because there's really not a lot that changes. So, the title of this chapter is called Integers. Okay, integers. So integers are basically the whole numbers plus the negative numbers. Okay. Sorry, I'm just checking my recording here because I'm changing my mic around. The integers are whoops. Let me get this here. The integers are the whole numbers together. Whoops, sorry, whole numbers together with the negative whole numbers. Okay. So what's a negative number? Well, if I write something like -2, or we could read it as -2. Some people say -2. This is it basically means the same thing as 2, right? Which is 2 means that we have 2 of something, but the negative indicates that instead of having 2 of something, it's like we lose 2 of something. Okay. So it's very much like subtraction in that way. In fact, -2 is the same thing as 0 minus 2. It's like we have nothing and then we still lose 2. So then we end up in the negative. So we could think about like a great example of this would be like debt, right? Like credit card debt or something like that. So with credit card debt, maybe in your bank account you have, let's say our bank account is $100 and our credit card debt is $400. Altogether, we have negative $300, right? So this negative means that how much we've lost outweighs how much we actually have. So it's like we owe $300. So that's what this negative means. It means that we have 300 less than 0. Okay. So um if we made a number line, okay, where we list all of our numbers, we could have 0 in the middle here. And then to the right of it, we'd have our 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. But then to the left of it, that's where we would have the negative numbers. So it goes in the same order. It's just kind of backwards, right? -3, -4, etc. So if we wanted to know how to like count, we could do it. Whoops. Sorry, let me move my mic away a little bit because I think I'm a little too loud. I usually have it a little further away. Um, so we can use this number line in order to do like addition or subtraction with negative numbers. For example, if we want to do something like -2 plus 5, the way we would do this with a number line is the first number tells us where we should start. Okay, so we start at -2. Okay, so we start at -2, and then the plus, this tells us, here, let me write, this is where to start. This is the direction. Okay, so the plus means go in the positive direction towards the positive numbers, aka to the right. And this says how many spaces. Okay. So start at -2, go to the right 5 spaces. Okay, so we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we're at 3. So our answer here is 3. Now, one thing you might notice, or you might be used to handling negative numbers if you've seen them before, -2 plus 5, well, addition can be done in any order. So this is the same thing as 5 plus -2. And when we're adding a negative number, it's actually the same thing as subtracting the positive number. Okay. So this is the same thing as 5 minus 2, which is 3. This might make a little more sense when we talk about multiplication. But the basic idea is that if we have a positive and a negative right next to each other, overall it gives us a negative. And likewise, if we had a negative and a negative right next to each other, overall it gives us a positive, which we'll talk about that more in the multiplication part of this. So let's do some more practice with adding though. Okay, if we have 7 plus -3. So like I said, this is the same thing as 7 minus 3. So it should be 4. If we want to do it with a number line though, so you don't have to do it with a number line. It's just a nice thing to default to if it is if it gets confusing, which it might, especially when we do subtracting a negative. So the 7 is where we should start. So we start at 7, and then the plus sign. So this one is a little bit weird because the plus sign is telling us to go towards the positive numbers, but then we have a negative sign right here. So the negative kind of flips it back in the other direction. Okay. So the negative always changes our direction. So here we have the plus telling us to go to positive, but the negative says to reverse that. So whatever direction the first sign was telling us to go in, the negative reverses it. So we're going to end up going to the left 3. And then we're going to end up at 4. Okay. So let's think about subtraction with this. Okay. Let's do a smaller one. What if I want to do 1 minus -3? Well, let's draw our number line. Okay. So we're going to start at 1. The minus says go left towards the negative, but then the other minus sign flips it. So we start out going left, but then we flip, so we end up going right. Okay. So we're going to ultimately go to the right 3. So we're going to go 1, 2, here. 1, 2, 3. And we're going to end up at 4. Okay, so this is where we need to be very careful, is with subtracting negative numbers. One thing you might notice here is subtracting a negative is equivalent to just adding the positive number. 1 minus negative 3 is the same thing as 1 plus 3. Like I said before, this is because the negatives cancel out and they give you a positive, which we saw with the direction here. And that's going to, we'll learn about those rules when we talk about multiplication. But two negatives cancel out and they give you a positive in general. What if we have a negative 5 minus 4? Okay. So here's negative 5, negative 6, negative 7, negative 8, negative 9, negative 4, negative 3, negative 2, negative 1, 0. So we're starting at negative 5. And then the minus says go in the left direction, go towards the negative numbers. And then we're going 4 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So we're going to end up at negative 9. Okay. So you can always come back to this number line. The first number tells you where to start. The sign tells you which direction to go. And then the last number tells you how many spaces. The only thing you have to look out for is if you have two negatives or two signs in general, because the negative is going to flip the sign. All right. What if we have a negative minus another negative? Okay. So we're starting at negative 3. The first minus says go towards the negatives, go left. Then the second minus flips the direction. So we're going to end up going to the right. And we're going to go 4 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So we're going to get 1. So negative 3 minus a negative 4 is 1. Again, this is the same thing as just doing negative 3 plus 4. Which is in turn the same thing as doing 4 minus 3. Okay, so there's lots of different ways you can flip it around. As you get used to these rules, they'll become more apparent, and then they'll become faster because they'll just turn into like normal addition problems. Okay, so we've done every combination of subtraction and addition. So let's move on to multiplication. Okay. Multiplication really just boils down to remembering some rules. And these are the rules that I've mostly been talking about. Okay. So let's make a table here. Let's say this is our first number. This is our second number. This is their product. Okay. So what we're trying to do here is think about what happens if we do something like negative 5 times 7. So what's going to end up happening is that we're only going to need to worry about the 5 times 7 part, and what sign it is going to depend on this chart. Okay. If the first number is positive and the second number is positive, then their product is going to be positive. Okay. This would just be normal old multiplication that we've always seen, right? 5 times 7 is 35. Positive times a positive gives you a positive. Okay, so it's not too bad. Not so bad. What about a positive times a negative? Well, let's think about it. Okay. What if we had 2 times a negative 3? Well, One way we know to think about multiplication is that this would be like -3 plus -3, right? You add -3 to itself 2 times. And what we're going to end up with here is a -6. And no matter what this number was, if we have a bunch of negative numbers and we're adding them to each other, we're always going to end up with a negative. So this is a negative. Okay, a positive times a negative will always give us a negative. The other direction shouldn't make any difference because the order you do multiplication in doesn't matter, right? 2 times -3 is the same thing as -3 times 2. So a negative times a positive is also a negative. Lastly, what if we have a negative and a negative? I've mentioned a few times that they cancel each other out. And that's what happens here. If you have a negative times a negative, you end up getting a positive. If we want to think about that more intuitively, think about um, this would be like um, sorry, a negative times a negative. We could think of that as like losing a debt, right? So if you lose a debt, then that means you come out positive in the end, right? Like if we have a debt of $500 and we lose that debt of $500, then we've come out positive, right? We have $500 more dollars now. We're worth $500 more dollars now. So that's the good way to think about it, is as losing a debt. So let me erase this at the bottom here so that we just have this chart. It's not too confusing. So we have our chart here. So a good way to remember this, if they have the same sign, if the two numbers have the same sign, then it's a positive. If they have different signs, then it's a negative. Okay. So if they're both positive or if they're both negative, it comes out to be positive. If you have one positive and one negative, it comes out to be negative. Other than that, you don't really need to worry about anything. Like -5 times 7, it's 35. And what sign it is just depends on the chart. Because you have a negative times a positive, this ends up being a negative. Okay. If we have 6 times -3, it's 18. And if it's negative or positive, depends on the signs. Because we have a positive times a negative, we get a negative. Okay. -4 times -5. Now these are both negative, so they cancel out and they give us a positive 20. Okay. So that's all we're doing here. We're just remembering this chart. So make sure you know this chart. It's going to come up all throughout the semester. This also can simplify the subtraction because, like I said, in the middle here, we can kind of think of it like multiplication. We have a negative times a negative, so overall, that's a positive. 5 plus 7. So this is 12. Okay. So that's just one way you can think about it, or you can just use the number line. Okay. So negative times negative gives you a positive. Positive times negative gives you a negative. Okay. Division is the exact same way. In fact, we can like go ahead, take this chart here, let's copy it. Maybe shrink it a bit actually. Let me shrink. I don't know if I can. And we can take out product and put quotient. And it's the same thing. Okay. So with division, it works the exact same way. If we have 6 divided by -3, it's going to be -2 because we have a positive divided by a negative. if we have a negative 6 divided by 2, it's going to be negative 3. If we have negative 18 divided by negative 9, we end up with a positive 2. Okay, so the negatives cancel out. So division works exactly the same as multiplication. So one thing we can think about here is some unique numbers like 0. Like, is 0 positive or negative? And the answer really is neither. 0 doesn't really have a sign. Okay, so when we multiply something by 0, we don't have to worry about positive or negative because we just end up getting 0, right? Another thing is 1. Multiplying by negative 1 is going to be a very powerful tool for us because what does that do? Well, if we multiply 18 by negative 1, we just end up getting negative 18. Okay, so all it does is flip the sign. In fact, if we have a negative number, like say negative 9, we can think of this as negative 1 times 9, right? There's no difference. These are equivalent. This will be really helpful in solving equations. For example, let's say we have 5 minus x equals 3. Okay. Actually, let's start with 7. Okay, we want to get x by itself. So let's subtract both sides by 5. And then we'll have negative x equals 2. Right? We don't want to know what x is. We want to know what negative x is. But we can think of this negative x as negative 1 times x. Okay. And now we can do something that we haven't really talked about yet, which I'm going to write down after this, which is divide both sides by negative 1. Okay. These cancel out because anything divided by itself just gives you 1, and 1 times x is just x. Okay. So we just get x. Over on the other side, 2 divided by negative 1 is negative 2. So this gives us our answer. X in this one ended up being negative 2. And we can check 5 minus negative 2 is indeed 7. All right, so there's a lot to unpack of what I just did here. First of all, I just showed that we can divide both sides by a number if we want to. This is called the division property of equality. So this says if A equals B and C does not equal 0, then A divided by C is equal to B divided by C. Okay. So in other words, you can divide both sides by whatever you want except for 0 because we can't divide by 0. Okay. This is something that's very important. We have to make sure we're not dividing by 0. So for example, if we have something like 2x equals x, where we have a variable on both sides, we shouldn't be dividing by x, right? Because if we did, then, all right, let me back up. If we have 2x equals x, okay, the division property of equality says we can divide by whatever we want. So we might be able to divide by x, but we can't divide by 0. And because we don't know what x is, x could be 0. So we have to make sure we're not doing that, okay? Sure enough, if we divide by x, these will cancel out. and these will cancel out and just give us 1, because anything divided by itself is 1, right? So we'd have 2 equals 1. But that's not true. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that if we actually solve this equation properly, we find out that x is equal to 0, so we shouldn't have been dividing by it. Okay. The proper way to do this would actually be subtract x from both sides. Here we can combine like terms. 2x's minus 1x is 1x. Here we get 0, so we get x equals 0. So don't worry if you're not following this too much, because we haven't done equations with variables on both sides yet. That's not till a later chapter. But this is how it would work. So the only way, we're just kind of easing into this property with only dividing both sides by -1. Okay, so dividing both sides by -1 is a nice, easy trick we can do when we end up with negative x equals something like maybe -7. If we just want it, we don't want to know what negative x is, we want to know what x is. So an easy trick is to divide both sides by -1. Okay, and here's another way we can think about it. Negative x divided by -1. Well, this is going to be a positive, and whatever x is, if we divide it by 1, it's going to stay the same. So on this side, we're just going to have x. So this is another way to think about it instead of thinking about canceling it out. Negative times a negative gives us a positive. Anything divided by 1 stays the same. So this is just x on the left side. And on the right side, we have -7 divided by -1, which will be +7. Okay. So dividing both sides by -1 is a common trick to get rid of a negative in an equation. Okay. We'll do more with dividing both sides by numbers, but we really should talk about fractions before we do that, because fractions, a lot of times when you divide both sides by a number, if it doesn't divide evenly, then you end up with a fraction. So we're going to talk more about fractions before we go further than just dividing by negatives. But that's all for today. So make sure you practice on especially subtracting negative numbers, because it can get kind of confusing. Always default to that number line if you need to. And remember, you make sure you memorize the multiplication and division rules about like a negative times a negative gives you a positive, and negative times a positive gives you a negative. And make sure you're comfortable with the like dividing by -1 trick, which just comes from those multiplication and division rules. Okay. All right. So thank you guys for watching this today, and I will see you next time.